welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by two scholars, two writers who are here to talk about a fascinating book that I am so excited to check out more of, and I am so excited to talk about it. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you both to introduce yourselves and your book?
Sure. I'm Dr. Chelsea McCracken. I'm an assistant professor at the State University of New York at Oneonta. And I'll let Matt introduce himself and then we can jump into the book.
Sure. My name is Dr. Matt Connolly. I am an associate professor of film studies in the Department of Creative Arts at Minnesota State University, Mankato.
Thank you so much for joining us. Yeah, and let's talk about the book, 100 Queer Films Since Stonewall. Before we get into the book itself, could you both tell us a little bit about your careers as academics and your research and teaching interests?
Sure. So Matt and I actually went to graduate school together at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So that's how we met and how we began our professional collaborations, which have been pretty extensive. And I was very excited to have the opportunity to work with him on this book. So my personal research interests often center around queer feminist film and media. So I have a broad range of time periods that I look at or types of media. So I've written about television and classic Hollywood film, as well as going up into more contemporary film. Matt, do you want to jump in and give a little bit
Sure.
about?
Yeah. So like Chelsea said, we went to grad school together, and I think that's, kind of somewhat shaped our sort of collective interests in queer cinema. So I also study LGBTQ cinema, primarily within the United States and primarily within the kind of 60s, 70s, 80s range. And where that goes, ranges a bit. My dissertation focused on John Waters and looking at sort of the overlaps of sort of queer identity and queer film, but also manifestations in sort of industrial context. So that sort of overlap between sort of queer cultural production and sort of film industry mechanics are something that I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah, and Matt and my work corresponds quite well because we have a similar methodology or approach to thinking about LGBTQ cinema, and we just differ in our time periods. So, Matt's dissertation was more in the 70s, mine looks more at the 80s and early 90s, looking at how different factors within film industries created space for a queer cinema movement in the early 90s, the new queer cinema movement. So we've both got, very complementary research interests and approaches. So it made this a wonderful collaboration in many ways.
Nice. Yeah, that begins to answer what my next question was, which is about the when and the where of when the collaboration began. Can you tell me a little bit about the work that you've done together before and perhaps the inception point for this project?
Well, we've
Yeah.
given a number of conference presentations on the same panel. Even when we would submit papers not together, sometimes we would end up on the same panel because of how well the material kind of fit together in a broader discussion of, LGBTQ cinema or film history. So that's some of our previous work. I don't know if you want to fill in, Matt, and then talk about how the book came about.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. It's kind of become a running joke that we either, if we don't put ourselves together on a panel in a conference presentation, we're put together by others. So maybe that, it's the universe telling us something, right? So for this book, so this is part of the BFI Screen Guides series that the British Film Institute and Bloomsbury Academic put out together. And so all of these different books in this series, it's the structure of, 100 blank films. It could be genre, it could be, different sort of national context, cultural context, things like this. So the publisher was looking to do a book on 100 queer films or 100 LGBTQ films or however you want to describe it. And a colleague that I knew sort of basically was like, I heard this idea, something that I don't want to or I can't pursue at this time, but it's something that you should consider pursuing, given that what I study. And one of the first things she said to me after she said that, which was obviously very good advice, was think about who you want to write this with. think about it as a collaborative project. And truthfully, the first and only person I thought of was Chelsea. So I approached her and was really hoping she would say yes. And then when she did, it was very good. In part because, as she was saying, we have a kind of different sort of maybe niche specializations or points of interest within sort of queer cinema, but we have a kind of a broad orientation towards the subject that's pretty simpatico. So I think that led to a good fruitful collaboration on this project in particular.
Yeah, and I believe we submitted the initial proposal for it in fall 2020. So it was definitely a labor of love in the very chaotic time in, teaching remotely and all of that. But again, having a strong partner in putting it together and a clear vision for what we saw as this. And I'll also add that, when we started, we were thinking, okay, 100 queer films. We started generating a list. And it got so big so fast, we thought, we're barely going to be touching all of these different decades. What if we time constrict it? What if we look at, in the last 50 or 60 years, what if we narrowed it down there? And that would give us a chance to dive into lesser known films instead of having to hit kind of the greatest hits from the last 120 years. So that was what we did. And I believe Bloomsbury is, and the BFI series is coming out with 100 queer films before Stonewall. So a complementary installment in the series. So we'll have to put them together as a box set there because I think they'll work very well together. But yeah, so that was how we decided let's look at this time period in particular. And we thought a lot about breaking it at Stonewall. So Matt, I don't know if you want to say something about our decision to make it that point in particular.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I should say, I mean, Chelsea was the one in particular who was like, let's figure out how to narrow this a bit so we can actually delve into some more unexpected corners of the topic, which was, I think, one of the kind of great strokes of genius of this entire process. In terms of Stonewall, it's a point that is in some ways kind of, I think, pretty self-explanatory, right? Obviously, the Stonewall Uprising was this major turning point in, queer politics, queer culture, the gay rights movement, certainly within the U.S. context, and obviously both Chelsea and I are sort of U.S.-based scholars. It's also something we thought about critically because it's not like Stonewall happened, everywhere in the world, and we are trying to cover a global perspective on cinema. So I think we tried to think about Stonewall not as like a sort of totemic object that, affected all cinema, queer cinema after it in the same way, but as kind of a bit of a prism, right? Like there are some films we talk about in the book where the impact of the Stonewall Uprising and the sort of gay liberation movement is directly seen in the form and content of the movie. And then there are other films that we write about from other nations, from other cultural contexts, from other times that have nothing to do with Stonewall or contest Stonewall or sort of critique the politics of that time or adopt a different view on the politics of that time. So we wanted something that people would know, a reference point that people would at least be familiar with, while at the same time offering us some space to branch out in different directions, kind of using that as a hopping off point.
Y'all are so good at anticipating what my next question will be. You already began for it, which is so great. Yeah, I really am interested in your selection process. I'm really interested that, yeah, your inclusion of Stonewall helped you to restrict your pool of considered movies. But I'm curious what else sort of factored into your selection. There are some agreed upon classics in the 100 films you've chosen, but there are some that are some deeper cuts, like when I saw The Duke of Burgundy, I was like, oh my gosh, like I haven't even talked to anybody about that movie. This is so great. So yeah, could you talk a little bit more about your selection process?
Yeah, absolutely. That was the hardest part of the entire book, I think.
Mhm.
So we started out by creating a document that put every single film we could possibly want to talk about in there. So just throw everything at the page, create the biggest list we could, and then from there we worked to narrow it down. There were some films that we knew from the get-go we were absolutely going to put in there, either because they were, personally significant to us, or because they had really clear spots in queer cinema history. So those were, ones we started pulling out first. And we really did make a concerted effort to branch out from a US centric lens. We tried to include as much as we could films from other cultural contexts or, national contexts, because we are really passionate about having this be seen as a global book. Now, we did have limitations in terms of access to films. There were some that we had read about and we really wanted to write about, and we just could not find a copy of it anywhere. So that is a limitation in some instances. So yes, we started going through there, trying to get a broad range of, as I said, national context, but also thinking about gender representation, thinking about trans representation, thinking about, race and representation. So even within an American context, we tried to have our American films be fairly broad in terms of who we were representing within those spaces. So that was a lengthy, many discussions, many, heartbreaking films that we were leaving off, and we, really wish we could have included them, but it just didn't fit, or it was too much of the same. As we started writing the book, then we would get to a point where sometimes I would be writing an entry and I would think, I've talked about this in a different entry. Like it's not showing us anything new. And we did go chronologically through the films in the book, and we're trying to craft a sense of the history of queer cinema. So if we have two films that are very similar in a lot of ways, it was okay, can we take out one of those and make space for this, another film that would show us something different or something new in there? So that's my thought. Matt, I'm sure has some things to add in there that I've forgotten.
Oh no, I mean, I think you covered a lot of it. I mean, one other thing other limitation we put on ourselves, and this is particularly, as kind of film people, this leads to some heartbreaking decisions, is we basically decided one film, one director rule. So like we were not going to have multiple films by the same filmmaker, again, in an attempt to like branch out and broaden out the scope of what we were including. Obviously, this leads to further heartbreaking omissions. Again, I'm a big John Waters person, only having one John Waters movie, but I think it was like a productive limitation, right? Because it makes you think about movies in all variety of ways, right? Not just through the lens of the director, but through the lens of, yeah, and through the lens of formal innovation, different types of generic contexts, national context, cultural contexts. We're also really proud that this book, while I think the vast majority of titles are, feature length narrative fiction films. We also have documentaries in there. We have short form experimental works in there. We have works that are kind of sort of unclassifiable in terms of genre or, film type. And that led to, I think, ultimately a pretty broad palette. I guess the last thing I would say is, with a book like this, inevitably, this book is as much about what was on the cutting room floor as what made it. Certainly, we're proud of the 100 films that we chose, and that each of them are very valuable and offer a wide ranges of like ways into them, which I think we wanted. But we hope that these are, the first 100 films you watch, the first 100 queer films you watch, not the last 100 queer films you watch, or the only 100 queer films you watch. That this book, it gives you movies to watch, but it also gives you hopefully a spirit of exploration and discovery that you can move out into the world to find other titles that we didn't include or couldn't include or didn't even think to include.
Yeah, for somebody who, here at the library, I work in the media department and I curate film for the collection, all these things. And the list was very humbling for me because I think I had seen about 10 or 11% of them, which I guess is 10 or 11 movies. But it gave me a lot of really interesting directions to go in with my viewing. And I did watch one new movie for this interview. I was like, I'm going to look at a classic I've never looked at. So I watched Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And I was really interested in how, that movie was obviously of its time in some real ways, but also very ahead of its time in some of its, I think, conversations about like parenting and things like that. So could you maybe talk a little bit about what your favorites on the list are? Maybe the ones that you have researched and also sort of like your personal faves.
Wow, that's a great question. One that I probably should have anticipated. Um, I like the distinction between maybe the ones that we researched the most versus our favorites. And I think there's certainly some overlap there. I mean, I guess I would say maybe two in response to that for me, although there's maybe a bunch of others I can talk about. For research, I mean, not to return constantly to Waters, but he is a kind of main research topic for me. So being able to include and write about female trouble was a real gift. That's a movie that in some ways I think it sort of has only sort of grown in esteem over years. For a long time, I think Pink Flamingos was thought of as the sort of John Waters 70s midnight movie classic. And, I love Pink Flamingos too, but Female Trouble just kind of embodies so much of what Waters does really well, like the shock value, the extremity, the grotesquerie, but also the camp humor, the social commentary, and the kind of odd kind of empathy he has, I think, for characters that are many times beyond the pale, and yet there's still a kind of a focus on their extremity and sort of queerness that is, to me, very energizing. One movie that I would also pick out that is a personal favorite of mine, and one that is maybe one of those under the radar titles that I'm glad is in the book, is a movie called In the Family, directed by Patrick Wang. This is in 2011. This was a movie that got very, very little commercial distribution. It didn't play major festivals, but it became a bit of a minor, for those who saw it, a bit of a minor cause celeb of like, wait a minute, like this is a good movie. And briefly, it's a movie about a gay couple, two gay men, and one is white, one is Asian, and one of them. So the questions of kind of ethnicity, race, and class are also tied in with questions of gender and sexuality. One of them passes away unexpectedly. They have an adopted child. And the movie is about this sort of custody battle that goes on between the surviving parent and then the deceased parent's family. It sounds very heavy, and it is very heavy in some ways, but it's also an incredibly empathetic, nuanced look at like how we define family, what it means, how it changes. It's also an incredibly formally accomplished film. It's done in these sort of amazing kind of long takes that are beautifully blocked and staged and shot. So it's a movie that I think even now is a little underappreciated. So I'm happy it's in the book because it offers a great cinematic experience and also I think a good window into kind of both the limitations that people sometimes experience around questions of gender and sexuality, and also the possibilities of connection across those differences.
It's always hard to follow Matt. He's so eloquent in his discussion of things. One of my personal favorites is But I'm a Cheerleader. So it's a comedy set in a gay conversion camp, which doesn't sound like it's going to work, but it really does. In large part because of just the over the top, not only performances, but the mise en scène or the set design, the costumes, everything is designed to be really artificial. So that the feeling you get when you walk away from it is that this camp that they're going to that's intended to be the natural way of, forcing these teenagers into heterosexual lifestyles actually is the most fake thing about it. And it has a really beautiful love story that, feel good ending in it. It's actually a film that I assign in my introduction to film class when we talk about things like costume, set design, all of that. And I like including queer films in a class that's not about queer films because we can still enjoy and appreciate these as works of cinematic art, while at the same time getting, a chance to experience films that maybe students haven't seen before and can kind of open their eyes a little bit to them. And they tend to enjoy it. And that's one thing we do hope with this book, that people might be able to use it in their teaching. So if they do want to assign films that are listed in this book, whether it's for a queer cinema class or another class, they can use these entries as jumping off points for that. So similar to Matt, I think I'll mention too. I could really talk about any of the films that that we wrote about here because they're all really beautiful. Examples of different aspects of queer cinema. But I'll also mention Spider Lilies. It's a Taiwanese film by Zero Cho from 2007. It's a film that I saw back in grad school when I was trying to watch as many queer films as I could for can't even remember what class, but it's one that really stuck with me. And so when we were writing out our initial film list, I put it on there because I remember that being a really good film. And then it was one of the entries I wrote. As I delved into researching it more, I realized it was really a groundbreaking film. And the director, she's like amazing, the work that she's doing in Taiwan and throughout the different countries in Asia. So that was one that I appreciated in its subtlety. It's one that really makes you think. It sticks with you afterwards. And I think a lot of these films do. When I'd be watching them and writing the entries, they would stick with me for days. And that's how I knew that we picked good ones, that even after I've, put it aside and moved on to the next entry, it's still lingering in there.
Mm.
Yeah, but as I said, I could pick pretty much any of these films. And I'll admit there were some of these films I had not seen until we put them on our list here. And we'd heard about them, we'd read about them, and some of them I watched them and they just blew me away and were really, really remarkable films. So I even just the process not only of writing but of going back and watching all of these films, that was really impactful to me, having the opportunity to go through and experience or re-experience each of these pieces of film history.
Yeah, I was wondering if the pandemic made that easier or harder, because I was teaching and I was in grad school too when that hit and we had to move our classes online. And it was really, really hectic and intense for a few weeks while all that got figured out. And then there was like a lot of time. So, but how many movies do you feel like you watched preparing for this? Did you rewatch a lot? Were there new ones that you watched that ended up on the list or?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, right before I was going to write an entry, I watched the film that I was going to write about and took detailed notes, even if I had seen it 100 times before I rewatched it, to make sure that I had it fresh in my mind for writing the entry. And there were some that we watched when we were in the deciding phase and thinking like, are we going to pick this one or that one, or how are we going to do this? And that would help us like, no, this one's a really the better film, or this one does more that we want to do. So I think in some ways it was refreshing to have something else to focus on or to divert attention to. Just, to let yourself fully sit down and watch a film and appreciate it and let it, watch it from that lens of both appreciating but a critical sense. It's a different viewing experience than kind of casual viewing or background viewing. And I think there is something really nice about that. I mean, I'm a film scholar, so of course I think that, but I think there's something really wonderful about that. And even when the world is crazy and going up in flames, you have these films that give you this sense of centering. And just there's some of them that are just so beautiful, they'll move you to tears. And even ones that get cliched or talked about a lot, like I watched Brokeback Mountain again, and that's one that certainly has gone up and down in terms of people poking fun at it or using it in different ways, but it's a heartbreakingly good film. And so rewatching that, you feel it really, in a lot of these. And it's something we went through with a lot of these, is they are films that make you feel something about the characters, about the situations. And so in that way it was a sort of a cathartic outlet in viewing. Matt, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I very much second all that, especially the kind of catharsis of watching some of these movies, particularly at that very kind of fraught time. I remember when we were thinking about the kind of movies to watch, and movies that you've seen before but you rewatch. I remember yeah, again, a movie it's no shock that it's in the book. It's kind of a modern classic now, but rewatching Moonlight kind of early on in the pandemic, a movie that I really liked when I saw it the first time. And I don't know, maybe it was the movie, maybe it was the time, but like that, I like sobbed during that movie, like in a way that, and it hit me in a way that it hadn't before. And I think there were a lot of movies during the pandemic, queer or otherwise, for which like your emotional connection or your affective connection to it really did change a bit, as as we're all working through our own stuff. The other thing I would just say just off that is, I think the process of trying to select movies, it does make you, there's always like a little bit of like in the back of my mind when I was watching any movie of kind of like, oh, like I wonder if this would be like, what's the queer thing in here? Or if you're watching a new movie, because because the book, I think our final entry is from 2022. So we were, obviously there's a lot of movies that are kind of set in stone at a certain point in terms of we want to include them, but we always had an eye towards, well, how far can we go up to the present? So there was always a bit of watching certain contemporary movies of like, oh, is this going to be a contender? Is this doing something unique or different? Which was certainly a fun way to watch a movie. It's nice to have it done so that you can kind of turn off that part of your brain, just maybe watch it in other ways. But that was definitely a very interesting thing to be viewing movies through during this time.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in at that too. We set our initial list when we submitted the proposal, and then, the writing of it took a couple of years. So we had the opportunity to expand it a little bit. And for example, I watched the film Flee in another context, and I just was so blown away by it that I went back through our list and thought, what can I remove in order to put this film in? Because I really, really want, it's an animated documentary that tells just this amazingly touching story and does it in both an artistically beautiful way through the animation and also just in a subtle, real way. Even though it's animated, you sort of forget that. And it's like you're really experiencing and feeling this person's life as it happened. And it was, challenges that they encountered. So that was one I watched and I thought, yes, I want this in the book. And I'm sure I'm going to keep doing that from now on. Like, oh, we would do a revised version so we could put this new film in, because that's the wonderful thing about queer cinema is, when we looked back at films in the 70s and early 80s, we had a lot fewer to pick from that were just, and there are some countries that we really wanted to find films from, that area, and we just couldn't find them. They have a much shorter history of openly queer representation in film, but it just keeps exploding. We keep having more and more representation, which is wonderful. I mean, we can always stand to have more, but it is refreshing when we hit the 2000s and the 2010s. Like, wow, we have so many options that we have to narrow down because there's just so much more being produced now through streaming services, through different independent companies, through even big studios like Love Simon Studios jumping on the bandwagon of LGBTQ film. So we'll see if it continues, but I do hope it will.
Yeah, jumping off of that, my wrapping up question, do you each have a favorite or a recommendation from post 2022?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to do a gotcha. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. This is good. I think I have one. This is a movie that, yeah, I mean, has gotten a fair amount of press and attention. So this is not like a totally original thought. But from this past year, the film I Saw the TV Glow by the director Jane Schoenbrunn, I think is a pretty extraordinary movie, and one that I think their career as a director and that film in particular, I think if we were writing, 100 queer films after Stonewall, it would probably be in there, because it's a movie that is, on the one hand, like extraordinarily formally accomplished, and what Schoenbrunn does in terms of just the kind of aesthetic beauty and unsettling quality of that movie is amazing. And it also has this relationship to trans identity and experience that is communicated through it's not like a sort of overtly or explicitly, coded film about, trans coming of age, but like if you think about it sort of allegorically and how it's like constructing this relationship between these two characters, so much of that is communicated through form, through kind of emotion, through sort of the shape of the movie. Yeah, it was one of the more impactful experiences I had in the theater last year in general. And I think it's one of those movies that we're going to look back on in 5, 10, 15 years and be like, oh, that was a major movie. And I look forward to seeing what they do next as a director, because I think they're one of like the main major voices in contemporary queer and trans cinema today.
I loved that movie. It was
right?
really affecting. And yeah, some of the imagery just stayed with me for a very long time. And also, there was that uncanny effect of, oh, this is a filmmaker who is around my age and had a very similar sort of media inspired childhood and was consuming the same media as me. And like, that was like a sort of wow moment too.
Yeah, as a Buffy fan, I definitely felt very very connected to some of the sort of televisual stuff and references going on in that movie. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel as though I should have more coming to the top of my head, but one I'll mention, I think is from 2023, is All of Us Strangers. So it's like it's a very haunting film that really delves into like family and loss and connection in, and what that looks like in the world, and just really beautiful visuals. I mean, that's it's actually a film I saw at the Telluride Film Festival when it came there, and I think it was the first film I saw at the festival that year, and it was just like really is a really moving representation, and just the I don't have to put the atmosphere that they create. It's more than just the storyline. It was something about the either visual or audio um, space that they really delve into there that I thought was particularly moving. The other one I'll say one Nimona. It's a cartoon, and it's this fantasy. It's about this knight who's framed for a crime, and he has to team up with this shape-shifting monster. But is she really the monster? But he has this relationship with another man in it, and it's not something that is seen as it's not the core of the film. The core of the film is something else. And I do appreciate when you see movies where the queerness of the characters is just part of them and it's not something that necessarily solely defines them, or it's not the source of tension in the film. It's just something that is there and is happening. So I think that one's a lot of fun. I remember watching it one night and really enjoying it. So I think it's a Netflix film. Yeah.
Well, excellent choices. Yeah, I loved All of Us Strangers, and Nimona was just phenomenal. It is so funny and so sweet, and I am very excited and jealous of the children who get to grow up with it, you know?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been so interesting. One last question. What is next for you? I know after, huge projects, academics need to rest a little bit, but what are you working on in the future?
Yeah, well, some of my other research that I'm kind of developing now strays away a little bit from queer cinema, but I've been engaging in a large-scale project where I actually re-edit Hollywood films to include only the moments when women are speaking and look at how the gendered differential between both amount and quality or what they're saying differs from male characters in films. So that's a project, as I said, it's been a while in the coming, and it will still be a while. It takes a bit to re-edit films, but I have a production side as well as the sort of studies side, so I like combining those. So I'll probably continue with that. At some point, I hope to turn my dissertation into a book and dive back into 80s and early 90s LGBTQ film, but we'll see how this first project goes, and then jump into that one again.
I'll just jump off that. I also am in the process of long-term process of turning my dissertation into a book or some kind of revised state. And again, that's the project on John Waters, and it looks particularly at his work in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and his sort of construction of his directorial kind of persona and public image, and how that sort of began in the mid 60s, has developed over the years, and has led to the figure that we still have with us today.
Those both sound like fantastic projects. I'm very excited to see what you do next. Thank you again for coming to talk to us and our listeners. This has been absolutely fascinating. And yeah, I've really enjoyed talking to you both.
Thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much
This
for
was so much
having us.
fun.
No problem. All right, listeners, it's your turn. Please check out 100 Queer Films Since Stonewall. watch all the movies in it. Watch all of them. I am well on my journey, so I wish you luck on yours as well. By the time that you hear this episode, it will be out in the world. So go to your favorite bookstore or a library, perhaps. All right, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.